Yeah, Mr. Searcy, there's an item in the news this morning I'd like to get a comment from you on. Federal Judge Tom Wiseman has suggested that we legalize all drugs. He said so many of the cases coming before his court have to do with drug offenses. He says, why don't we just legalize all the drugs and therefore take the profit motive out of drugs? I'd like to get your comment on that.
One thing that a trial lawyer is always careful about, and that is criticizing federal judges, particularly those who still sit. Nevertheless, I think that Judge Wiseman's off base in his analysis. Simply legalizing or even decriminalizing drugs still doesn't take the criminal incentive to steal to get the money necessary no matter what price it would take to support drug dependency, when drug dependency is so debilitating that you don't work often cases or don't have the capacity to work. So I think that's a little short-sighted. I think, though, his focus on the problem is very real, and we as a nation must get a lot tougher about how we deal with the drug problem. And in a follow-up question, I'd like to deal with it.
Okay. Mr. Clement, legalize the drugs.
Teddy, I was really surprised Judge Wiseman said that, and I'm like Walter Searcy. I totally differ with his approach. I think what we need to do is, the port of entry is a good place to stop a lot of these illegal drugs. Also is a good, tough, effective drug education program in our schools. I saw some surveys recently. 80% of all the crimes being committed now are drug-related, and 40% of the even 10-year-olds have been exposed to drugs in terms of being approached. So it is a very, very serious problem, and I surely don't think Judge Wiseman's proposal is the correct proposal.
Okay. Mr. Bredesen, does it make any sense to you?
It doesn't to me. I think it is appropriate for society to set some values for itself, which it's going to honor. And one of those in our society, I think, is and should be that substances such as illegal drugs are simply not appropriate, not to be sold, not to be manufactured. And I think you have to deal with the issue in several ways, obviously through trying to control their importation, but most fundamentally through doing a better job than we're doing of educating our kids to the dangers of drugs, to the life-compromising and life-stealing ability that they have. And I've been very strongly proposing for months now strong programs in this area.
Okay. Ms. Eskind.
There is a slogan that is used in another context, but it says a mind is a terrible thing to waste. And that's the way I feel about drugs. I think when you use drugs, when you're involved with drugs, you're simply wasting your mind and you're robbing yourself of your future. And I have the greatest amount of respect and admiration for Judge Wiseman, and I'd love to hear him explain why he feels that this is appropriate. I don't. I, too, have read statistics that show from 50 to 80% of crimes are drug-related. I think we need to reduce the demand. I think we need interdiction. I think we need mandatory drug education, and I think we need mandatory life sentences for those adults who sell drugs to minors.
All right. Mr. Searcy, you wanted a follow-up question on it, but let me ask you, is what you're hearing here beneficial to the political standpoint? I mean, if one of you said, yes, I agree with Judge Wiseman, we ought to legalize drugs and take the profit motive out of it, would it harm you politically? Is that the reason why everybody's disagreeing with his position?
Well, I can tell you why I disagree with it. I've contemplated that as an alternative, and I've thought about it. And I just came down on a different side of the issue. I don't think that decriminalization or legalization of legend drugs, scheduled pharmaceuticals, is a way to deal with it. I think the way to deal with it is, and also I don't think the way to deal with it is to focus solely on our children and tell them just say no. We need to be telling adult America just say no. And we need to stop abusing substances ourselves and have dual standards so that we abuse Valium and other prescribed medications, but at the same time want to tell our children to stay off drugs. It's incongruous.
All right. Mr. Clement, does it make sense, though, logically? I mean, if you didn't have to appeal for votes and you were simply looking at the matter from the logical point of view, if you take the profit motive out of something that's harmful, Doesn't that neutralize that something?
I really don't think so, Teddy. And I heard and read what Judge Wiseman said, that permit them to buy it, and then they can just kill themselves. And that would be all right if it was just those people, but we're talking about a lot of other people that would be exposed to those drugs as well. And I just think we have an obligation and responsibility to a so-called civilized society not to move in that direction. And I don't know why he said it. Maybe he's done a lot of research on it, but I'm like the others. I've come on the other side of the table concerning a matter such as this.
Mr. Bredesen, what made you change your mind on the legal marijuana issue?
Well, the legalization of marijuana was an idea which I had briefly 17 years ago thought was wrong at the time, and as you know, has popped up again here recently. What made me change my mind, I guess, is that is seeing the real, the awful consequences to young people. I don't care about the crimes that are committed, which is what I think Judge Wiseman is focusing on so much. I think what he's not focusing on is the awful consequences to young people who get involved in some way with drugs, often slipping in very easily through things that seem to be acceptable at the time, and progress on to things which are, literally destroying their lives. I think those are the people we owe the obligation to, and that's why I'm just totally opposed to it.
Obviously, Mrs. Eskind, something's not working in our enforcement or our education somewhere along the line on the drug problem.
No, I think, as I said, we must have mandatory drug education in a safe environment and reduce the demand for drugs, as well as tighten up our enforcement, tighten up our borders, and tighten up our relations with the companies, with the countries which export drugs. But let me answer your question with something that you said, which was, if we took the profit motive out of something harmful, and the clue to the answer is something harmful. And I think everybody agrees that drugs are harmful, and whether they're legal or illegal, whether they're profitable or unprofitable, they are harmful. And we must stop the use of drugs if our future depends on it.
And Mr. Searcy, could you feel comfortable separating marijuana from hard drugs or cocaine and legalizing marijuana or decriminalizing marijuana to a greater extent than it currently is?
Well, that's a societal call, and I think I'm comfortable with currently state-by-state legislation on that. I'm not in favor of a federal law that would have a uniform federal application on how marijuana is dealt with or not dealt with. But if Ohio wants to give first-time offenders 20 years, they ought to have the right to do it. If California wants to give first-time offenders below a certain amount of probation, they ought to be able to do it as well. That's a societal and cultural call that I can live with. What I can't live with, however, is our inability to recognize fundamentally what the drug problem really is in this country, and it's an adult problem much more than it is a child problem, and it begins with us. It ends with the children, but it begins with us, and until we recognize that manifestly, we're not going to have any resolution to these problems.
Would you have any societal difference for the Nashville marijuana law?
No, I think that our marijuana laws are solid here in this state. Let me also say that mandatory life sentence is problematic because, as you'll note, mandatory life sentences wind up giving people an option to get out of jail in 13 years. I think the drug dealers to youth ought to be in prison a lot longer than 13 years.
Okay, Sandra?
Mr. Bredesen, what is the most appropriate role that the federal government should be playing in trying to reduce teenage pregnancy?
I think, first of all, the federal government can play a role in terms of making available educational materials to school systems, which I believe is the fundamental answer to that issue. We have a Department of Education now. One of its functions is to do research and to provide material to local school systems, and I would like very much to see it continuing to do that. I do not believe the federal government should get involved, as this question is often posed, in terms of making available the funding for or directly contraceptives to teenagers, for example. I think that's an inappropriate role for the federal government and is approaching the problem from the backside.
Ms. Eskind?
I think that the major role of the government, both state and federal, in this is a role of education. I think we have put our heads in the sand like the ostrich in saying if we don't talk about it, it's not going to happen, and that's just not true. And we need to be straightforward and direct and let children learn where they will learn in school about pregnancy and about how to prevent it.
Mr. Searcy?
I believe the question is sex education generally and its role, its place in school. And clearly there's a place for sex education in school. We have a society that has been uniquely disserved by our not paying attention to this problem earlier on. Sex education probably should begin as early as 6th grade, and it should be on a continuous basis and a systemic basis. And parents should be compelled to be involved in it in some way, in a similar way we compel parents to be involved in the truancy of their children. And I think this makes eminent sense, and I think our society probably is ready or is approaching being ready for it now, particularly given the consequences of us not doing it.
Mr. Clement?
Sandra, part of it is education in our schools. Also, family counseling, directing would help. A lot of young people that have children have a very low self-esteem. And also, many of them don't have anything. And they almost have a child because they want something of their own. And we've just got to do a better job as a society as a whole, not just government, but society as a whole, to have more sensitivity and compassion there and help them where we can and direct them in other ways.
As a follow-up, Mr. Bredesen, are there circumstances where you would advocate spending federal funds for abortion?
The only circumstances under which, basically, I'm opposed to the use of federal funds for abortion. A circumstance of rape or incest, a circumstance of a serious threat to the health, and I mean the physical health, not the mental health or the economic health of the mother, and conceivably in cases of compromised children, Down syndrome children, for example. I think there may be an appropriate federal role to make sure that less fortunate people, poor people, have access to some of the same choices that others have. Other than that, I think it's wrong.
Ms. Eskind, I'd like to ask you this question, but I'd like everybody else to answer the question as well, please. The House Ethics Committee never released its findings on Bill Boner. If you're elected to Congress, do you think they ought to release those findings?
I think it would be inappropriate for me to try to second-guess the House Ethics Committee. I think they did what they did as conscientious public servants. They reviewed the case thoroughly, and they made their decision, and I would not be about trying to second-guess them. I would like to use the remainder of the few seconds to, Walter suggested that sex education begin in the 6th grade, and were you 12 when you first learned about sex education? I think it needs to start. I think it needs to start a lot sooner than that. I think that the 6th grade is too late, absolutely. And I also think that Bob talked about family counseling and sex education. We don't live in a beaver-cleaver family world where their families communicate well, and that's appropriate, but it's not realistic.
All right, I believe my question was, Mr. Searcy, if you're elected to Congress, would you ask the House Ethics Committee to release its findings on Mayor Boner?
I don't have any particular interest in them. So, I mean, you're asking and I don't perceive any genuine public interest in them. If there was some public outcry, I think that public outcry need to manifest itself in some way, and then we can consider whether it's a live issue. I don't think it's an issue now or in this campaign.
Mr. Clement?
Teddy, I'm not after a witch hunt. I think the people in Davidson County spoke loudly and clearly in this mayoral election. I don't know the rules and regulations or the confidentiality of the House Ethics Committee or whether they will make that public or not, but I'm not going to pursue it.
Mr. Bredesen?
I doubt there's anyone on the face of the earth less likely than me to reopen this particular subject. I do believe that the House Ethics Committee has a responsibility to the people of this country to, looking forward from here, to be as aggressive as it can in looking at and looking after allegations of impropriety. I think the reputation of the Congress depends on it, and to the extent to which I can be a voice urging that, I certainly will.
Sandra?
Mr. Searcy, what specific federal policies would you advocate to control AIDS?
Well, I believe that the first thing that the federal government should be about is marshaling the resources necessary to create the teams of specialists and investigators, physicians, biochemists, endocrinologists, and the like, to lick the problem in a similar way that we addressed the poliomyelitis problem that was such a plague and a curse on my generation. I suggest that the funds are already available for such an effort. We just need to redirect them. We need to gut Star Wars in the funding, in the research for it, and put it in AIDS research.
Mr. Clement?
The federal government needs to be the lead role in finding a cure for AIDS. It's a horrible disease. You think about it, supposedly by 1990, 5 million people are going to be infected by AIDS. Probably 200,000 people here in the United States will die from AIDS by 1990. So one is research to find a cure for it. Number two is education. And I'm talking about increasing the level of information about AIDS, because I think there's a lot of misinformation today. And also, we need to reduce the level of fear, because there's a lot of confusion concerning AIDS today.
Mr. Brodesson?
I think AIDS is an excellent example of what happens when you let politics seep its way into something that should be handled, I think, much more independently, or at least politics as usual seep its way in there. AIDS is an enormous public health problem. It's probably the first and the largest public health problem we've confronted in a long time in this country. It's unfortunately a marker disease for homosexuality, for drug use in particular, which tends to tie it all up with a bunch of other issues. I think that from the conservatives' point of view, we have tried to make it a disease only of gays and drug users, and not dealt with the research, and that's an essential kind of thing to move forward. We're years behind where we should be in that area. I think we also definitely need to work in the area of education.
Ms. Eskind?
I have said that this country mobilized a Manhattan Project which took lives, and I think we must have a similar type Manhattan Project to save lives. I think we need education. We need a massive education effort. I think we need to understand the relationship between AIDS and drugs, and I think we also need to have leadership in this country to stem the misinformation and hysteria, and we need to guarantee and be certain of the civil rights of all people, including those people who are afflicted with the disease or pre-disease.
Mr. Searcy, now that you've all agreed that AIDS is a terrible thing, could you specifically state your position on such proposals as giving condoms to prisoners in federal prisons, supplying needles to drug users?
Yeah. I think those are, again, attempts to address the symptoms, and in no way can be thought about as anything rising to the level of policy that we can rely upon as a safe and reliable solution to the problem. The only way we're going to lick this disease is to find a cure for it. That's bottom line. And that's what we need to be marshaling our resources on. You can give condoms to prisoners. You can give sterile hypodermics to drug users. That's not going to resolve the problem ultimately, because a sterile hypodermic now becomes a dirty one later, and so on.
Daddy?
I want to ask the next question to Mr. Clement. There's a bill before Congress to make English the national language of the United States. Would you vote for that bill?
I believe I would, Teddy. That doesn't mean in certain parts of our country, maybe all over the country. I'd like for us to learn Spanish. Matter of fact, I'm encouraging that right now. I'm in the National Guard, and we have a humanitarian mission in Central and South America, and I'd like for our people to know how to speak Spanish when they're down there. And so I have a real appreciation for other languages, and I've learned a little Spanish and a little French. But in order to compete, in order to survive, in order to get a job, I think English has got to be the universal language here in the U.S.
Okay, Mr. Bredesen?
Yes, I would support it. I think that this is a country of a great deal of diversity, and that's very healthy. I also think that part of its genius has been its ability to be a great melting pot, to be a place that's brought a lot of diverse cultures together and built a new culture out of those diverse cultures. One of the things that I think makes that possible is a common language base and some other common shared values, a basic belief in the democratic process, for example. Those, I think, are important if we're to retain the kind of wholeness as a country and the kind of thrust as a country that I think we need to survive and to provide the kind of life for people who live here that we all want for the next generations.
Okay, Ms. Eskind, should English be the official language?
My answer is yes, and I agree that it's a pity that more of us are not at least bilingual, that we aren't conversant in more than one language. But I can't ever picture the time when our official documents would be written in any language other than English, except as an accommodation to another country or another government. I think English is our official language, and I see no reason to change it.
All right, Mr. Searcy?
The question, I believe, was, would I support a measure pending before Congress now that would make English the national language of this country?
That's correct.
And I would not support that measure. I think it's ethnically chauvinist. I think it spits in the face of the cultural diversity that makes this a great nation. We don't live in a part of the country where there's a lot of diverse language pattern, but there are areas in this country where there clearly is, where there's the confluence of Asians, Hispanics, Native Americans, and other persons, Aleuts and South Pacific Islanders, and to impose such or to rise English as it currently exists to a national language brings real problems for me, particularly me coming from a minority group, and I would resist that.
All right.
Mr. Bredesen, should the minimum wage be increased?
Yes, I believe it should. It's been, I believe, 7 years since it was last adjusted. Inflation has been substantial during that period. I believe in the notion of a minimum wage, and I believe adjusting it to at least take into account that inflation is a useful thing to do, and something which is meaningful and needed for the all too many people in this country who work at or near the minimum wage.
Ms. Eskind?
The level at which our minimum wage is set now means that for a family of four working a minimum wage job 40 hours a week, even working, their income is $1,800 below the poverty line. Our values are not quite synchronized when we want people to work their way out of poverty and then pay them a wage that is below poverty. I think we need to increase the minimum wage so that it's realistic and so that we are not hypocritical in the way we address that issue.
Mr. Searcy?
Yes, as a matter of fact, a little more than a week ago, I released a statement to the press in response to the assertions by the Vanderbilt Institute of Policy Studies that minimum wage may, in fact, be minimum wage increase may be more detrimental to the poor than helpful. That's a farce. The reality is we need to not only raise the minimum wage, and we need to raise it to the $4.65 an hour standard as proposed by 1991, but we also need to be about the business of retraining persons who fall in the area in our workforce that currently only qualify them to flip hamburgers and do things at minimum wage levels. Further, we need to be very careful, however, about indexing that to the CPI. I would be against indexing the minimum wage to the consumer price index.
Mr. Clement?
Yes, I would support an increase in the minimum wage. Congress is talking now about from $3.35 an hour, where it is now, up to $4.60 an hour. There's probably going to be a compromise there of around $4.25 an hour. It may not all go into effect at one time. It may be spread over 3 years. But we have more and more minimum wage jobs, and we seem to see the gap growing between the haves and have-nots that much more, and it needs to be increased.
As a follow-up, Mr. Bredesen, does your support of that mean that you support the pending legislation of the 465?
There are some, as I understand it, 40 bills in the Congress that address the minimum wage in some particular way. I would like to see the minimum wage adjusted for the inflation that's occurred over the past 7 years since it was adjusted last, and that number comes up with a number much closer to the compromise that Mr. Clement talked about than the 465, which is the favorite bill in Congress, or even the $6 or $7, which some of them recognize. But I think that some adjustment to reflect that inflation is badly needed.
Mr. Bredesen, let me ask you, we recently had the Great American Smokeout. Cigarette advertising is illegal on radio and television. It's become unfashionable to smoke cigarettes, yet we subsidize tobacco farmers, and they grow a lot of tobacco in Robertson County. Should we continue to do that?
I don't think it's fair to put that on the tobacco farmers. First of all, I think it's inaccurate to say that we subsidize tobacco farmers. Tobacco is one of the few farm crops in this country that has a price stabilization system that, in fact, has not required any significant amount of federal money to make work. I personally believe that the usage of tobacco, particularly cigarette smoking specifically, has health dangers associated with it. I personally don't smoke, but I think that there are many people who choose to, and that we should be making sure that the people in our community who grow tobacco have fair access to those markets, which are going to continue to exist for a long time.
Mrs. Eskind, would you comment on that?
Sure. I think that one of the ways, and I'm amazed at the variety of ways in which the right hand of our federal government doesn't seem to know what the left hand is doing. And one of those is with the tobacco farmers, specifically those in Robertson County. On the one hand, the federal government says it's terrible that we have such a terrible balance of trade, and our trade deficit is so out of line. On the other hand, it cuts the allotment for the tobacco farmers, and it imports foreign tobacco. We don't know the quality of that foreign tobacco. We don't know the chemicals that have been used in growing it. We know very little about it. We have no idea that whether or not it's as healthy as domestic tobacco, yet we bring it in at the detriment and peril of our own local farmers. And I think